Buenos días. Si os parece, empezamos ya, segundo día de las conferencias. Hoy tenemos ahora, en primer lugar, el tercer plenario, el último plenario de estas jornadas de Economía Crítica. Y para este plenario nos acompaña Alessandra Mezzadri. Alessandra es profesora del Departamento de Desarrollo de SOAS, en Londres, de la School of Oriental and African Studies. Ella es licenciada en Economía por la Sapienza en Roma, pero luego hizo estudios de desarrollo ya en SOAS, y allí realizó también su tesis doctoral sobre la mano de obra barata en la industria textil, en la industria de la confección en la India. Y sobre este tema tiene también un libro publicado por Cambridge University Press que se llama The Sweatshop Regime, Laboring Bodies, Exploitation and Garments Made in India, que se publicó en 2017 y se ha reeditado en 2020. Sus investigaciones se centran en las desigualdades, en el comercio, en las cadenas mundiales de producción, trabajos informales, normas internacionales laborales, responsabilidad social corporativa y esclavitud moderna, feminismos, nuevos feminismos, género y globalización, los enfoques sobre la reproducción social y la economía política de la India, el país en el que se experto. Trabaja actualmente el análisis marxista como metodología para el trabajo de campo sobre los nexos entre la reproducción social y los debates sobre el trabajo informal y sobre las temporalidades productivas y reproductivas de la explotación en la industria intensiva en mano de obra. Y sobre esto también tiene una obra que ha editado el año pasado que se llama Marx in the Field, de la editorial Anthony Press. Trabaja también con organizaciones internacionales y ONGs como la OIT, Action Aid, Labour Behind the Label, War on Want, SEWA India y Anti-Slavery International. Bueno, en los últimos años ha publicado varios artículos sobre los impactos del COVID desde un enfoque de economía política feminista en la reproducción social. Lo podéis encontrar en el año pasado en Feminist Economics y en Review of International Political Economy también. Y hoy nos va a presentar parte de su último trabajo, que también podéis encontrarlo publicado ya en Organization, que se llama Social Reproduction and the Pandemic Neoliberalism, Planetary Crisis and the Reorganization of Life, Work and Death. Bien, os dejo con ella.
¿Me sienten aquí? En primer lugar, gracias a Economía Crítica, Paola, especialmente, y a la Universidad de Castilla-La Mancha por esta invitación. Gracias. Y me siento muy honorada de estar aquí hablando de mi trabajo. Segundo, tengo licenciatura en Economía, pero no me considero economista, nunca trabajo como economista. Me siento un poquito como un party crasher, ¿no? Acá, pero espero de ser una buena party crasher. Y tercero, entiendo el español muy bien, porque tengo parte de mi familia en Bogotá, pero no puedo hablar de trabajo en español. Entonces, ahora vamos con el inglés. Muchas gracias. Y gracias a Paula por la introducción. Okay. Before I start, I think I have to introduce this round of work that I did in the last 3 years. I worked mostly all my academic life as what I would define as a fieldwork political economist. That is, I spend a lot of time talking to people in the field, reconstructing my own data, because mostly, as mentioned by Paola, I worked on informal economy and informal labor relations. So for me, the beginning of the lockdown was quite harsh. It meant we had to stop all our projects, basically. But also, for me, it had become, at that point, considering what we were going through, really important to see how the instruments of political economy, and particularly of feminist political economy, could guide us to understand the moment we were living. So not to see COVID as a disruption only to our academic lives, but to see what, as academic, we could say about the moment we were experiencing. And I don't know what really went through different people's minds, but for me, for sure, there were a number of images that I found very powerful and that really sort of pushed me in terms of thinking which type of inequalities we were seeing revealed by COVID, and that has become a research agenda that I stayed on for around 3 years. So for me, some of the images, to give you a sense, is sort of the background to the presentation that I find really resonating or sort of triggering my imaginary on trying to sort of talk about inequality in COVID time were several. This is the first one I would choose. This is an image of students from the University of Manchester. They were illegally detained by privatized lockdown decided by universities in halls of residence to keep them inside the halls of residence so they continue paying rents. Because of course that would have been one of the major issues for universities in the UK. So these forms of illegal privatized lockdown, see in the picture students trying to escape as security guards hired by the university tried to keep them in. He caused a massive riot that was broadcasted in national television and appeared in major newspaper. The second picture is this is a painting by the Indian drawer Hasif Khan, and he represents the moment where informalized workers leave urban centers in India to go back to rural villages. We've seen actually live images of these people leaving. Many of them actually were reported as getting sick and dying as they were making it back to the villages. It was again covered in national and international media. So the first, if you want, talk about what happened to reproductive sectors, and the second talked about what happened to the realm of work. And of course, this is a third shocking images that we have seen that sort of speak about the reorganization and management of large-scale death that we experienced during COVID. This is New York City creating mass graves around Manhattan, and of course you have similar pictures for India. So I just started with these imageries because in the process of reconstructing how we talk about COVID, I think we have to do a process of trying to stitch together what is our entry point that we find useful to start even tackling what is it that COVID showed us. So among all the different ways in which the pandemic was portrayed, I really liked an editorial on the New Yorker that was written by Keanga Yamaka-Taylor, who is one of the scholars that influenced massively the Black Lives Matter movement. And they wrote in March 2020, American life has suddenly and dramatically been upended, and when things are turned upside down, the bottom is brought to the surface and exposed to the light. So that basically what COVID did was, as a magnifying glass, actually showing a massive level of inequalities that characterize this particular phase of capitalism, which is neoliberal capitalism, so much so that this has been quite simply articulated in the last Oxfam report that looks at trends in inequality, where Corona is called the inequality virus. Now, many authors refer to the pandemic phase as a crisis of capitalism or a crisis of neoliberalism. I think this is mostly incorrect. In fact, I would agree with what Tom Pally said yesterday, that is the business cycle is actually hardly finished. There was a hiccup that we can identify with the pandemic, because the main tenets of neoliberalism, we will see, were not just deeply implicated in the ways we reached the pandemic, but also it was reinforced by it. And so with it, the inequalities we saw. What I think is instead correct to argue is that the pandemic is a crisis of capitalist life, that is a crisis of the type of social reproduction that has posed itself as the dominant way in which we live since the onset of neoliberalism. So a crisis of social reproduction. Social reproduction being a term, for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, that was originally deployed, in fact, by Karl Marx to make reference to the transmission of inequality in a capitalist society, and that was then reappropriated by generations of feminist scholars to actually account for silences in Marx, particularly in processes of production of the worker, right? Marx wrote a lot about production of commodities, but who produces the worker has been then the focus on social reproduction. Now, social reproduction as a term means quite simply all the activities aimed at regenerating life as well as capitalist relations together. So this distinguishes from only focusing on societal reproduction, which was what Marx talked about, as well as care, which is what other generation of feminists have talked about and is specifically identified with the given form of reproductive work. So it's a term that aims at bringing life at the center of how we understand the way in which capitalism works. And I think it's a tremendously useful lens to actually guide us through what happened during the pandemic, so that we can represent the pandemic as a compounded crisis of social reproduction. Now, there are particularly three processes that I will touch upon. The crisis reveal the extent and impact of marketized reproductive sectors, health and education, of course, health in particular, if we look at how we got to the pandemic and also which countries had the harsher impact of COVID overall. Second, we reorganized massively the world of work, actually recrafting the productive reproductive continuums. Many of us became home workers overnight. Others instead couldn't work at all, with the massive differences between the north of the world and the south. And third, the crisis led to an acceleration of processes of generation of surplus population. So we had a massive exposure of who is more prone to die of capitalism, which is ultimately the main reproductive question, which I would say political economy looks at far too little. So the crisis can be read across three axes. On the one hand, when it comes to the architecture and governance of capitalist life. Second, in terms of the reorganization of patterns of work and exploitation. And third, in terms of the political economy of death. So these are the three axes that I'd like to talk about in the presentation. Now, there are different schools of social reproduction, and just so that you are aware, I'm using the work of different authors to explore these three axes. Social reproduction theory guide us very well through the first axis in terms of the governance of capitalism, of reproductive sectors, the work of Nancy Fraser, the work of Kitty Bhattacharya, Cinzia Arruzza, among others at the New School. The second, instead, I'm guided by older debates on feminism about the value-producing nature of reproductive work and care, the work of Silvia Federici, Leopoldina Fortunati, Selma James, among others. And the third, it looks at novel contributions by feminists of color that worked at the interconnections between work and health outcomes, starting from colonial and slavery times to date. And there's exciting work done, for instance, by Gargi Bhattacharya in a recent book, Rethinking Racial Capitalism. Now, in looking at these three axes, my argument will always be that this cannot be defined as a crisis of neoliberalism because it was massively shaped by neoliberalism and it ended up reinforcing neoliberal logics, as it appears very well also if we look at the financing that seems to be guiding post-pandemic interventions, at the very least, by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So let's start with the characterization of the first aspect of the crisis, so the related to the governance of what we can call the business of life. So Nancy Fraser, in some of her later work in the last 5 years, has highlighted how we can understand the history of capitalism as characterized by different regimes of social reproduction. That is, in each and every phase, we have a specific way of organization of life which has sustained the type of relations of production that characterize accumulation in a given era. Now, I don't have the time to look into all the different regimes she characterizes. She has a great contribution to Titi Bhattacharya's volume 2017, Social Reproduction Theory. What I want to pay attention to is her characterization of the neoliberal regime of social reproduction as one which is defined by the marketization and financialization of care. Now, these processes of financialization and marketization follow the fact that the type of policies enforced by neoliberalism, and that we touched upon yesterday and are quite well known, austerity in the global north and in the global south, the rolling over of structural adjustment programs, meant that we had double shock therapies where you have a contraction of fiscal policy in a context of also cuts of money supply. So because of this, you had a number of knock-on effects in the global south in particular. This manifested with the creation of huge care gaps, if you want. You don't have welfare actually offering support to public expenditure in given sectors. And these care gaps were actually not to be filled by a state which under neoliberalism was very slim. Now, the way in which these care gaps from a reproductive perspective were filled were on the private sphere through the creation of global care chains and women entering the labor market were basically insourcing in their homes other women to actually do the jobs. There are a number of people that have written about this, and Barbara Herrenreich, who I'd like to remember a week after her death, made amazing contributions to the characterization of global care chains. There are others, of course, Nancy Folbre writing on the US, Diane Elson writing on Europe, Stephanie Seguino, Janati Ghosh, and Naila Kabir, to name a few. Now, the organization of care into chains also hit reproductive sectors, that is health and education in particular, that also became very much exposed to processes of marketization and financialization. Now, this particularly through the instrument of public-private partnerships. If you look at the global south in the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen a mushrooming of public-private partnerships in education, as authors like Sonia Langille have talked about at length. In fact, in education, well, less so in continental Europe, but in places like I work in the UK, is a reality. Universities are businesses. That is also why you could observe the image that I showed to you at the beginning of the privatized security guards trying to keep students at bay during lockdowns. And in fact, we see massive level of entrance of financial operators, not just at the level of higher education, but also at the level of early years. As a mother to a 5 years old, I've been paid £1,400 for the best part of 3 years to have my child in care. This is classic in the UK, and you'd be surprised to know that the all early years privatized sectors in the UK is in the hands of a few companies, three for the records, that own 53% of all private nurseries in the UK. There's similar patterns of concentration and financialization of care we observe in the US and in Canada. Now, of course, this happens in a context of deepening household debt, which we have seen with the data shown by Tom Pally yesterday. So COVID-19, my argument would be, is a crisis that hit in crisis. So we already experienced decades of demobilization of resources in the public sector, and we had, particularly in health, sort of exposed ourselves in many countries to very high risk when the pandemic hit. Now, of course, if you look at the data for countries that experience a higher number of hospitalization in ICUs and particularly death, you see that it's very likely that many of these countries had either privatized healthcare systems, like the US, of course, which still tops the charts in terms of death overall, if you check the last updates. But also you find instead countries that, although having public health sectors, they privatize through the logic of private-public partnerships part of the health delivery, and that was considered to be not emergency-based. And for instance, if you look at the work done on Italy, it's amazing the disparity we find in terms of death rates between the south and the north. The rich north did much worse in terms of death rates because of processes of privatization that crept into the public system, which we don't find down south. There is work done by Marcella Corsi and Giulia Zacchia on this in feminist economics. Peru is one of the cases that have been talked about more, where we have a great neoliberal performer, if you want, because we have a double-figure growth rate for the country until we arrive at the pandemic. But then a privatized health system turned Peru into one of the worst performers in terms of death rates that we have found. And then, of course, the rising productive capacity that we've seen during neoliberalism has anyway been addressed towards forms of manufacturing that were hardly sort of easily adaptable once the pandemic hit, and the scramble for protective, personal protective equipment at the beginning of the pandemic, I think, speaks to that massively, with countries in Asia using garment factories to sort of readdress production of PPEs, and instead real trade wars triggered between Europe and the US, with quite famously Trump administration literally stealing a cargo of personal protective equipment in Shanghai that was destined to Europe. It's sort of massively covered in The Economist, this trade wars. Now, despite the failures of these models of private-public partnerships and creeping privatization into reproductive sectors, the cure to the neoliberal disease has been some more neoliberalism, so that if you look at the data by Urania Dimaku and Elisa Weinberger in the Canadian Journal of Development Studies, they showed how half of the COVID relief fund organized by the World Bank at the end of 2020 was channeled towards financial operators acting in the health sector, that by then was already become one of the biggest new sector for global financial assets. So a new sort of mine, gold mine, if you want, for intermediaries. So half of the fund was basically utilized to support yet other PPPs. Now, of course, we have seen some of this politics playing out in market for vaccines with a number of scholars from the global south, quite famously Jayati Ghosh, the feminist economist now based at Hammers, talking about vaccine apartheid. So yet another vector of reproduction of inequality. So that was a first axis, I would say, that sketches quite well the pandemic as a crisis of social reproduction, which in relation to the sectors that sustain life in a capitalist society, namely health and education in particular. Now, the second characterization of the pandemic as a crisis of social reproduction comes if we look at what happens to the world of work. Now, I remember at the beginning when the pandemic hit, of course, in the left, in parts of the left, and I think it was quite correct, was seen as one of the biggest validation of Karl Marx's insight that the capitalist system rests on labor. We haven't had any destruction of physical or financial assets, we have no war, we have no slump in productivity. Simply by removing labor from the system, due to the fact that we're locked in our homes, the system jammed, right? Overnight. So validation of the insight of labor as generator of all value. And the ILO calculated that in 2020, we lost the equivalent of 255 million full-time equivalent jobs. That is, part of those will be actual jobs, part of those will be hours worked. So with a reduction of the hours worked. However, the pandemic also validated Silvia Federici's point that the reproductive line of separation, and or as he was putting in mainstream debate, productive, unproductive line of separation is entirely fictitious, right? Because COVID restructured the world of work very significantly, and the productive-reproductive boundary was massively reorganized and very quickly. Of course, there were massive differences between the north and the south of the world. In the north, if you look again at ILO data, by the time the pandemic hit, around 30 to 35% of all jobs could be insourced in homes. Professional services of different types. We represent that. I'm sure you all enjoy your Zoom lectures. I just kind of did, I have to say. After a while, you get used to everything. So because of the composition of the labor market in mature economies, you had an insourcing and a process of reorganization of the productive-reproductive continuum that looked a certain way. Of course, in the global south, you had a very different picture that's given by the fact that in these economies where you already have a dominance of informal and informalized employment, you could paradoxically, though, had much less of this process of readjustment. And again, the same data tells us that only 6% of jobs could be insourced in sub-Saharan Africa, and only the same amount, between 6 and 8%, in South Asia. While COVID disrupted all dichotomies, and in a sense sort of validated feminist insights into how labor market works and what constitutes or not labor and which spaces of work might constitute or not labor, we've seen the creation of new dichotomies, in particular the rise of the very tricky category of essential work. Essential work, which has become sort of normalized jargon, refers to a hodgepodge of different jobs that actually made possible for us to survive, well, as middle classes, basically, as we were in lockdown. However, what essential work really is, varied massively across countries, speaking about the different ways in which life is organized globally. So if you look at the work of my very good friend, Sara Stevano, her and her team have in fact collected data on what constitutes essential work in different countries, UK, US, India, South Africa, Mozambique, and a few others, and have highlighted how out of the 53 different categories they compare, only 13 are the same. So that what was considered to be essential changed massively based on context. Also, the problem with the sort of debate on essentiality is how exploitative conditions were for a huge chunk of supposed essential worker. And based on line of gender and race, this has been an issue which has been discussed in many different countries. And finally, the problem that once you pitch someone as essential, you're basically saying that someone else is not, something that, according to many unions, led the way to processes of retrenchments that we have indeed seen during COVID. Also, what is essential really can be manipulated. I was talking to Paula before. In fact, as a UK academic, I've become an essential worker. So I was classified by the government as an essential worker in January 2021, which meant I could not be furloughed, which meant I was not entitled to part-time work, which meant I was supposed to send my child to school together with doctors and nurses and actual essential workers' children, creating a problem for school in a process whereby the government is dumping on families decisions about life under the pandemic. Now, despite the sort of celebration of essential work, the scene that has been massively underpaid across a great variety of economies, but what is even more, we've seen a massive ballooning of unpaid work contributions. And the gendered economy has picked up the pieces in a huge number of places. We have now sort of data for a great number of countries. And if you look at the double special issue, again, in feminist economics, that covered quite a good range of instances and countries, we have seen that sort of unpaid, often collective, women's labor has supported people in many contexts, particularly where rescue packages by the state didn't manage to arrive. Lynn Osome, based at the Makerere Institute, had looked at what happened in South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, and highlighted how the informal nature of work meant that the reorganization of food system, for instance, was hugely based on unpaid women's work, and the state couldn't actually support people involved through contributions. Bina Agarwal in India have looked at the setting up in Kerala of community kitchen, again run by women, that supported local population during the pandemic phase, only partially supported by the state. And Veronica Garo in Argentina has highlighted again how Economías Populares sort of absorbed the shock of pandemic life. So these were all forms of unpaid subsidies of the informalized unpaid economy during COVID, right? Processes where sort of sustained value during times where, you know, this value creation was not paid. Now, the ways in which the world of work was reimagined in people that could labor outside in a number of essential work and people that could shield at home was, of course, highly racialized and gendered, with outcomes varying massively across countries. That we have had a massive overexposure of racialized workers in activities that expose themselves massively to the risk of contagion. So, in a sense, what is interesting about the creation of this new category of essential work we've seen in the last 3 years is that how at once it was essential but spendable, right? So it was crucial, but it was depletable. And that has to do a lot of which cohorts occupied that space into labor markets, which leads me to a third characterization of the pandemic as a crisis of social reproduction, really exposing the sort of structural nature, I would say, of inequality in contemporary capitalism. And of course, this means that we have a quick look at sort of the picture for mortality rates. So I think COVID, quite strikingly, I would say, really posed the question very forcefully on our plate, that is, who dies of capitalism and who dies in capitalism, because it's the ultimate reproductive questions. And I think that he exposed very strongly what the African philosopher Achille Mbembe have called the necropolitics of capitalism. So how the power to dictate how some might live and some might die actually is shaped under in capitalist societies. And I think authors looking at the afterlives of slavery have engaged with these debates for a very long time, and particularly also looking at the interconnections between work, survival, and health outcomes. Now, the people can be let die along a variety of axes, and we also have seen this during COVID. There are people that actually died, and people that were denied the right to access political rights or social rights that meant they could either shield, they could access rescue packages, and so on and so forth. And I think this politics, Hobbesian politics, was shown quite dramatically during COVID, and in a sense has continued to shape itself in the aftermath, as we have seen instead the vaccine wars taking place for all of the last years. And they're not finished. There's a huge part of the global south that still doesn't have access to vaccines at all. So this different trajectories, if you want, of dying, either literally or socially or politically, that we've seen taking place during the pandemic, have shaped different types of surplus subjects. So in political economy, we are used to talk about surplus populations only with reference to labor. And I think, of course, if we look at the transformation of the world of work, that was an important aspect of that, but it wasn't the only type of surplus population we saw. So the first surplus population literally has been those that died during COVID. We just have a overall mortality that stands at 6.5 million at present. And you do have countries ranked quite using aggregate data you find it online quite easily. But actually, if you look at patterns across the different COVID years, something that the Lancet has done recently, it's a very interesting picture that emerges on what has been the trajectory that COVID followed, which in fact is quite similar to what's described by epidemiologists when it comes to Spanish flu. So it has, especially the beginnings, COVID being characterized as a Western disease because of very high death rates in Europe and the US at the beginning. But actually, starting 2021, we have seen countries in the global South really being hit massively, with of course India and Brazil catching up and now making it to the top 3 together with the US. But we also have seen that if we isolate the second year of COVID, in fact, the standout regions are not Western at all. So we have South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, Iran, of course, was another terrible performer, and parts of Eastern Europe. If you look at countries with a significant percentage of racialized people and ethnic minorities, that death rates, the differentials are really impressive. So that you have the BAME in the UK, according to the British Medical Association, died 2.5 times faster than their white counterparts. And in the US, Black people died 3 times more than white counterparts. Now, of course, in a country like the US, you can make the argument that because you're dealing with a privatized system and you have an overrepresentation of Black citizens among the poor, that is the channel that you would prioritize. But in the UK, for instance, you can actually infer that difference. So that seems that sort of race has killed across the board and across health systems. And according to the medical associations, you simply cannot actually infer or explain these final outcomes by looking at comorbidities alone. That is the classic diseases of poverty, obesity, diabetes, and so on and so forth, only explain a part of the picture. So in fact, I think this picture can only be explained if we go back and look at the patterns of work which we have analyzed, where you have an overrepresentation of BAME workers across pretty much all echelons of more precarious forms of work. On the other hand, these linkages between racialized labor regimes and the spread of diseases is something which in development studies is a link that is very well exposed by a number of authors that worked on development and health. So for instance, Bridget O'Loughlin's work on the production of affliction, what she calls the production of affliction in Southern Africa, has shown how migratory labor in pre-colonial and colonial time in the Southern Corn actually were linked to the spread of different diseases. And she traces this for yellow fever, malaria, and more recently, HIV and AIDS. So how we labor is really important for how we live and how we die, and in which condition we live and in which conditions we die. So then another type of surplus population, of course, that was manufactured by the pandemic was this massive reserve army, right? Which changed in composition in a sense that the relevance or prominent characterization of essential work within this meant that you had a multiplication of types of jobs which were now deemed essential, and there's your deliverers, your warehouse people, your drivers, that actually sort of were revealed as the backbone of the processes that sustain life in a moment like the one we experience. And I already referred to this as indispensably disposable people. Now, at the outer margin, so the second one would be, if you want, more in line with the classic surplus population as we mean it in political economy, although with the different qualifications that the reproductive function was very much central to the swelling of this round. The third, instead, is composed by what are called the rejects. So who was excluded from this picture, which again discursively was very clear, although I would say there were changes from the beginning of the pandemic. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of focus on the elderly, on the fact that, well, after all, the elderly had a lot of health conditions, right? What do you expect? So this narrative of we cannot really save certain cohorts when we have to focus our efforts towards those that count is something that we have seen sort of constructing itself from the 2020. And I think he had a very specific role, ordering role, and disciplining role. So, you know, the acceptance that some of us were in the cohort of those that is worth saving, right? Because it was also constructed because we constructed an other that instead was less worth saving. And we have seen this with actual material outcomes. So exclusion from rescue packages, criminalization of patterns of work, sex workers, sort of unions have made this argument throughout the pandemic, for instance. We have seen that this exclusion have actually been quite real for a number of liminal populations, Palestinians being excluded from vaccination programs run by Israel, prisoners at the beginning excluded from any vaccination rollout, and so on and so forth. Now, I think these are the three characterizations of the pandemic as a crisis of social reproduction that has sort of hit different realms of life, while instead the functioning principles of neoliberal capitalism have remained pretty much intact. We have seen a ballooning of inequality. We have seen concentration of capital at the top, actually quite stable. We have seen sort of the members of the 1% sort of massively increasing their wealth. Billionaires increased their wealth according to the data of the Institute of Policy Studies, as instead real wages fell throughout 2021. And I think the recognition of the different ways in which inequalities were manufactured during the pandemic can be sort of a good place where to start rethinking a number of debates in development studies and development economics. So I'll very quickly glance over one of these debates, which is quite closely related to what I do generally as field research, which is debates on informal labor, but then I'll spend a bit more time on debates on inequality that might interest more to you. Well, when we talk about informal economy or informal labor, especially when it comes to policy debates, the framing is quite binary, and it's either to see it as a realm of GDP generation. So these are, if you want, the more World Bank and under this auto-characterization of the informal economy as a result of overregulation by the state, or as a hindrance, so as a sort of exploitative realm that actually prevents GDP because of a number of structural deficiencies in the economic systems in the global south. However, during the crisis, we have really appreciated the centrality of informalized labor relations to sustain the system in times of crisis, and we also seen the multiplication of all the new forms of informalized labor and the ballooning of unpaid contribution that, if you want, set on a continuum. So I would say that debates on the informal economy and informal employment have to be sort of increasingly recentered on the role that informality plays in reproducing capitalism. If you want a function which is compatible with what housework does to wage work, right? So in a sense, the informal economy has covered the function of the global housework of capitalism in a time of crisis. And I think this, of course, can lead us to very different interventions in informal systems that do not necessarily only look at wage support, for instance, like instead the intervention we've seen recently. Not that, of course, wage support it doesn't matter. Of course, it does matter a lot, but as a combo of perhaps different interventions that I'll get to. Now, when it comes to inequality, however, I think it's really like we need to sort of rethink it all. Particularly in development economics, the debate on inequality has been entirely dominated by sort of modeling of the relations between growth and distribution. And even the path-breaking work of Thomas Piketty, I think, remains very much anchored to a sort of a framework which continues reproposing methodological individualism as a way to sort of study and explain inequality, where you start from income or wealth, in the case of Piketty, of course, as sort of the starting point to look at inequality. I think what we have seen with COVID is that income and wealth might well be very much the outcome of processes of deeply rooted inequalities, or what Francis Stewart has called horizontal inequality, or what Naila Kabir has called intersectional inequality, with income and wealth being then outcomes. So we have to refocus the attention on existential inequality first, and then look at income as a manifestation of these longer trends, something which I would say the global south is articulating ever more loudly when it comes, for instance, to the impact of colonization and so on and so forth. And it's actually leading a number of massive political debates on reparations, restitutions, and so on. Also, what I think COVID is very well pictured is that the labor market are not mainly receivers of inequality, so they're not simply sort of bearers of all the structural inequalities we've seen. There's fantastic work in feminist economics on labor markets as bearers of gender and more recently of race, but I think this is part of the picture, because labor markets have been reproducers of inequality. And again, during COVID, we have seen this with really in a very strong way. Now, what does this mean in practice? You know, I think ultimately we engage with theory because it needs to lead to politics. It needs to lead to change and to sort of policy implications. So I would say that a lens framed on social reproduction doesn't just provide us with a different reading of how the capitalist system works and worked under neoliberalism, and which type of inequality are generated and why, but also can guide us through a different set of priorities on how to imagine post-pandemic politics and policy. And again, connected to the three lenses I proposed here, I think at the very least there's three recommendations or three sort of sets of priorities that emerge from what we've seen in the last 3 years. The first is starting from care and the reproductive economy when we think about recovery, so that we just engage in what Susan Himmelwaite or Diane Nelson have called the caring economy. We're talking about reclaiming reproductive sectors away from privatization and away from PPPs, and so the provision of real services and the re-internalization by the state of a number of provisions, which manifest, of course, with specific goals and sort of targets for fiscal policy. The second is relates to the world of work, of course. And I think the pandemic has really shown the very great limitation of debates that pitch against each other wage support to forms of self-determination income or basic income. Because, of course, we need all of this. And this is something that feminist economists have been arguing for a very long time. We need forms of interventions that recognize the relevance of informal work, and so that manifest in wage support mechanisms. We're looking at setting up minimum wages, for instance, for informal workers, but we're also looking at care incomes, right? Even when this is privately performed, and not as an disbursement which is citizenship based, like, for instance, the debate on basic income is in some countries. It is a disbursement which is due because it's labor and is supported, in fact, the systems as labor, where labor could not sort of deliver otherwise. And the third is to recenter race and gendered oppression in our politics and policies. So yesterday we really talked about the need to dismantle homo economicus. But in order to do that, we really have to start from what has been now generations of sort of feminist scholars and scholars of color that have highlighted how, in order to imagine a different forms of distribution, we have first to reimagine a different political subject. And if we continue just criticizing the political subjects as given to us from mainstream economics, I think we can only do parts of the job. We just have to start from sort of rethinking entirely our history as people, and seeing racial and patriarchal oppression, for instance, as our common history, moving debates from economic efficiency to economic justice. Thank you.
¿Preguntas o comentarios? Bien.
Sandra, primero agradecerte esta visión global en la academia de todo lo que se ha ido haciendo, y también esta visión global a nivel mundial, un poco del impacto. Mi comentario es un poco en relación a lo que yo conozco, y es en relación un poco a agricultura, alimentación, mundo rural, y el impacto que ha tenido COVID. Entonces hubo un momento en que hubo muchos cambios. cambios incluso en la dieta alimentaria, en la forma en que la gente compraba, mucho más acceso directo al agricultor, más productos ecológicos, más confección en casa de los alimentos. Y todo esto parecía que era un cambio importante que había venido para quedarse. En el ámbito rural también hubo un cambio de pautas de migración, salida de la ciudad hacia entornos menos densos, ayudado por la tecnología. Ahora puedo trabajar desde casa con internet. Y ahora un poco el debate que tenemos es si eso fue coyuntural o fue absolutamente estructural. Es decir, que fue un cambio momentáneo, pero que no ha venido a quedarse. Y hay bastantes datos que dan idea que más bien una punta y que las cosas continúan, y que no ha marcado muchos cambios, ni en la alimentación, ni muchos cambios en las pautas de la manera de vivir. Entonces, yo, como tú dices, evidentemente lo que sí que se veía es que había unas pautas del capitalismo, unos movimientos que la pandemia incrementó. Pero yo creo que al final las pautas que ya llevábamos no han cambiado sustancialmente. Con todo, es un debate que ahora lo he cerrado, pero continúa muy abierto. Hay mucha gente en el mundo de la alimentación, en el mundo del desarrollo rural, que continúa teniendo grandes esperanzas de estos cambios que hemos visto gracias a la pandemia. Entonces, un poco yo lo que te preguntaba, ¿qué cosas positivas puedes ver en tu impacto sobre los movimientos que ha habido gracias a la pandemia?
Ya. Sí. Muchas gracias por tu pregunta. Para volver al inglés. Okay. I think the relevance of the impact is really sort of depending on the actual region. So the fact that we've seen back to business as usual, for instance, at least in India, which is the country that I know best, is the case in certain contexts and not others. But for instance, if you look at the patterns of circular migration back that were triggered by the pandemic, the level of intensification, at least of the women's burden in many regions, have outlived the pandemic. If you look at some of the work done, for instance, by Dina Agarwal and others. So in the longer term, I think it's still to be monitored what will happen. Although, of course, I would expect that some things will be back as they were. I think, though, that when you live through a period like this, there are some getaways that you have to sort of carry with you, even if one might think that is a temporary disruption, that can guide you to sort of not living through a crisis like this, or like an effect like this of a possible future crisis, especially as many epidemiologists agree that sadly this is unlikely to be the last global pandemic that we see. So to me, it's not so much, the question is not so much how long-lasting all the ugly outcomes with MAT are, but how we can learn so that in the future you don't have places that experience the pandemic in such harsher ways, like for instance was the case in the whole of the north of India, and many other places. I think, to me, the recognition of what we saw is actually very hopeful. So learning from what we saw for how ugly it was, I think, can be really hopeful if it means that you can then have tools in your hands to sort of push for different policies that reprioritize certain sectors of the economy vis-a-vis others, that sort of channel public expenditure towards certain sectors and not others, or certain targets and not others. So to me, this is very hopeful. And I think in this sense, the pandemic has really sort of brought the point home that you have talked about nationalization even by Boris Johnson, which I think it's amazing, right? So I think in this sense is what you can capture and how you can bank on some of the issues that COVID exposed, and that will be up to sort of political lobbying and political work to try to harness some of the spaces that COVID has opened in relation of showing who is it that sustains whom when crisis hit. In the US, for instance, there's been the passing of the domestic workers bills that would have been even imaginable before it. So that, in this sense, like capturing those spaces to me is what will become crucial. Well, see.
Buenos días. Gracias por su presentación, por su conferencia. Creo que no es el tema central de su conferencia, pero al final me he quedado un poco perplejo con lo que ha dicho sobre la renta básica.
Sí.
No sé muy bien a lo que se estaba refiriendo. Yo entiendo que la renta básica es un programa que puede ser discutible, pero evidentemente es un programa de lucha contra la pobreza y la desigualdad, basado en la utilización del sistema fiscal. Entonces me he quedado muy perplejo con la crítica. Entiendo que es una crítica que ha hecho usted sobre la utilidad de la renta básica. Si quisiera explicarlo un poquito mejor, se lo agradecería.
Sí. No, first, thanks for the question, or if I sort of explain myself poorly, but I'm actually very much in favor. What I argued was that I'm in favor of basic income. I just shiver a little bit when I call it basic income, because at least in the UK, as well as in India, the idea of basic income is related to ideas of citizenship and belonging, which makes sort of the debate trickier in an Italian context because of migration, in India because of rural-urban disparities. But basically, the idea of a living income, okay? If we want to sort of use a different jargon, I'm very much in favor. And I think COVID has brought home the point that that is really a policy that is needed. I'm very happy to have presented proudly with my T-shirt. I'm very much in favor. This has been on the agenda of feminist policymakers for a very long time. I think we need a distinction of what the income is for, so that debates that have linked la renta básica with citizenship, I think, are limited, and they see that as a sort of policy intervention of income support. My way of understanding what the basic income does is a recognition of your contribution, so to de-invisibilize unpaid labor and the contribution of different people to society, in a similar way that early campaigns of wages for housework have argued in the 1970s. And by the way, after COVID, you have the uptaking of wages for housework and different forms of self-determination income in a vast array of countries of the global south. India, Indonesia, Cambodia, there's a lot of really interesting debates going on. The fact that we can even discuss the idea of care incomes, recognition of performed unpaid care work in India in 2022 as the majority of women's labor that is invisibilized, so that you have stats that really don't help. You look at the stats and you're faced with 14% of women workforce participation. Is absolutely untrue. It only speaks about how badly we collect statistics, because everything is invisibilized. The fact that we have this agenda, I think, is great, so that these are sort of the type of debates that I think we're having, also because of the aftermath of COVID. But it wasn't an argument against la renta básica at all. I'd say, you know, give us bread and roses too. We want it all. We don't have to choose between wage support mechanisms and forms of basic income.
Traffic and well, the final questions. Okay, you were talking about informal work and informal workers, and they were extremely hit in the pandemic in all countries. We just saw at the beginning of the pandemic in some rich countries some temporary measures to try to protect them, but they were very temporary. And we didn't see those measures in developing countries and countries from the global south, where informal workers have a high percentage of the labor market. I don't know, during the second year of this almost third year of the pandemic, we have seen some improvement and some movement to try to protect more these informal workers that supposedly we recognize that their work was so essential, or we are not seeing any improvement in countries from the global south, rather countries.
Okay, I think the picture is extremely patchy. There's, again, starting with India, the Modi government has just, as part of the labor codes that have been rolled over now, actually, has made a push for the implementation of minimum wages to informal work as well, so to put it on par with permanent work. Of course, the problem is implementation. So they're already like trade unions that are just saying, well, actually, this is all good on paper, but it doesn't mean anything. I think in other places where you do have a huge amount of informalized labor, they're managing to create networks. Like, for instance, in Eastern Europe, there's been the creation of a network called East, which sort of collects all essential workers and able to form campaigns. So in the US, you have seen that this actually created a push for the passing of the domestic workers bills. So I would say that it's really difficult to give a final answer. Within the very huge world of informal work, I think the pandemic has created has carved some political space to at least think in terms of strategizing and using the debates or like the celebration of essential work for their own purpose. But it's all campaign based, you know, and so you have some progress made in some parts, but of course, I mean, take a country like India, 93% of the labor force is informalized. So it really depends which type of sectors you're looking at, I guess. But at the moment, there's a lot of emphasis on care activities, and I think one could harness this visibility, hopefully, in many contexts.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias, Alessandra. Damos por terminado la conferencia.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.